name is Chris Karn. I have been coming up here all my life, and Lake of Bays is a very special place to me.
I am Valerie Pringle. Whittingham is my maiden name, and that's sort of the name associated with this cottage, which is called Twin Pines on Glenmount Road.
My name is Bruce Connell, and along with my two brothers, Doug and Ian Connell, who are conveniently located in British Columbia.
My name is Marcy Watt. I'm the owner of this cottage, which is named Nordo, and it was built in 1904.
I'm Harriet Muirhead, and I've been on Lake of Bays probably since I was born, I'm in my 75th year.
My name is Wendy Losberg, and I'm the current owner, along with my husband Hines and two children, of Rocklee.
I'm Ann Gentles, and my maiden name was Watt.
I'm Richard Campbell. This was my family's original cottage that dates back to 1904. And it was kind of a funny way that they ended up in this area. It was through my great Uncle John, who was sick at the time, and my great-grandmother went to their minister and said, we have to do something, we have to, get them better. And they said, well, we have a religious camp that we go to, a retreat up on a lake called Lake of Bays. And the airs there will cure anybody. I absolutely love this place, and my great-grandfather, Alec, was from Scotland, and he thought this reminded him of Scotland.
My parents bought this cottage in 1929. At that time, there was no electricity, so of course no bathroom. We had an outhouse, of course, and we would come up for the whole summer.
And my grandparents bought this cottage in the late 20s. They'd rented before they bought it from some English people named Lloyd. Loved it, as did my dad, so we grew up coming here. My dad was like the greatest fisherman ever on Lake of Bays.
Well, back in 1963, we found the cottage literally at the end of a rainbow. And I was 17 at the time, and my dad said, that's got to be the place.
So this cottage that we're here today, called Rocklee, was one of the original 3 cottages on Glenmount Road.
I don't know whether it had a name before my parents bought it, but my mother walked up the hill, looked at the view, and she said, we'll call it Treetops.
It's called Braeside. People say, what's that? Well, that's the side of a hill in Scotland.
It's French, it roughly translates into Nord is north and O is water, so northern water.
Rocklee is like a rock paradise is what it represented. Yeah.
My mom and dad showed us the big cottage on Glenmount Road, and it was even higher up on the hill than this one. And we all walked through it, all 6 of us, with my mom and dad, and it was just a dollhouse inside. And my dad said, what would you think if we moved from Dickey Lake to this beautiful property? And the view was spectacular. So that was at the end of August. And in the fall, we were all sitting down at dinner in Toronto, and my dad sat down and he said, do you remember that big green place up on Glenmount? He said, that's where you guys are all going to spend your summer next summer. So we couldn't believe it.
I know I've looked at this same view of that island and that lake, this exact view, my entire life, and you do feel that view has never changed. I love it so much. It's just the most beautiful lake, and I love all these knickknacks. This cottage is my grandmother. There are paintings that she did. She painted little poems on the stairs going up. I remember so much. It really is, as they say, there's nothing as emotional as a cottage. My parents, my dad, my mom, my siblings, my kids, they love it. So it's just so connected to who you are, and it's just something that is so peaceful. When we grew up, and certainly when my parents grew up, this was really a busy area. This was one of the first areas, I guess, to be developed along Lake of Bays, this South Shore. And there were 2 hotels there, and a store,
and a church,
and a tea house,
and a post office,
and a gas station. Really,
it was thriving. Yeah.
Back in 1904, what ordeal it was to get here. because it really was horrendous. So this is how my great-grandfather would make it here. They started out really early in the morning with tons of luggage and lots of food and supplies from Union Station. They would take the train from Union Station to Huntsville, which would take them about 6 hours to get there. Then from there, they would take a ferry on Penn Lake, all the way down to the end of Penn Lake to South Portage. Once they got to South Portage, they went on Canada's smallest railway. It's just over a mile long, and it went from Penn Lake to connect to Lake of Bays. Then they got on the ferry at Lake of Bays and then took it all the way around and stopped at everybody's cottage and dropped them off. So it was about 14 hours to get here.
Take us all day to drive up here, and then my mother would arrange first with Eaton's to deliver food, canned goods and staples. Everybody, all the cottages got a large tin of campfire marshmallows. Those were the treats.
The ladies like my grandmother and her mother getting together for tea and, you know, walking babies in prams, wearing hats and gloves and dresses.
But they came up for the summer though. I mean, they didn't, I mean, they came in June and stayed until school started.
When they bought the cottage for $1,200, I think it wasn't until the 30s, maybe 32, 33, 34, that the power came along the Glenmount Road. If you needed Mr. Kelly to buy anything for you in Bracebridge, we used to put a white flag out at your gate at the bottom of the hill, and he would call up the hill, "What do you want?" and then you would tell him, and he would bring it the next day.
There was a man, Mr. Heaney, that would come from Baysville and kill the chickens outside the kitchen door, and you know, chop their heads off and their claws.
You remember that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, Mr.
And my grandmother would then have to singe the chicken because the hairs were still on it. And she'd roast it in the wood stove in our cottage.
There were two big steamers that were on the lake, the Iroquois and the Mohawk Belle. And we used to watch from the veranda the Iroquois coming across, and we would all go down to meet the boat at 11 o'clock. That was when, I guess, the gang of children all got together, and that's how we sort of got to know each other. We all went down for the mail.
With the Catholics, bring them to church, and then take them home so you'd see the Big One Ferry right in front of your dock, or you could swim in its wake just off your dock.
It was very exciting.
Thrilling to watch that. And then otherwise, we'd just watch it. It was like a metronome going from Norway Point back to Big One. It was so beautiful watching that ferry boat. I loved
and then people would come on their old launches. Remember, they came in the big launches to
come to church.
To come to church. So they came from, so you would just see all these launches
Sunday morning
coming across the lake.
Everyone else would go to Norway Point Church for, but they would get off at Big One Dock, and then they'd walk through what we refer to as the grove because of all the pine trees.
My mother had a rule that if I had a friend with me, which we often did here, that I couldn't go to a dance over at Big One on Saturday night unless my friend, of course, had a date too. So that was always very tense. If you had a friend with you, you had to find a date for the friend.
This cottage at one point was owned by Big One, by the Big One Inn Company. And one of the oddities about it is the 3 small bedrooms all have hot and cold running water, all have sinks. And we thought that was rather cool and rather unusual. Well, it was used for overflow of guest accommodation. And my dad recalled that when he was giving a speech at Big One, he literally had stayed here.
Then the war came, and of course things changed tremendously. And the boys all went off to war, and when we came after the war, most of us were married, and it was very different. The chauffeurs who drove people up to Big One, the guests would stay at Big One, and the chauffeurs would stay at Glenmount. Well, then next door to Glenmount, there was a hotel called Grandview, and the name was changed to Lake of Bays Lodge. People began to go on motor trips and want a little better type place to stay, and they slowly collapsed, and The little store was part of the old Wawa Hotel. It was a little round building, and it was, I don't know where it was at the hotel, but the Wawa Hotel burned down in 1923, and this little building was part of that hotel, but it didn't burn down. And it stood empty for a while, and then they towed it in the wintertime, and that was the little store at the bottom of Glenmount Hill.
And one of the interesting things when you look at the pictures is that they had cleared all the trees out. And this cottage is one of the very first cottages built, at least according to the pictures that you see. And at the time, there are all these huge, wonderful pine trees, and all the vegetation that surrounds us has grown up since that time, but it was a field. It had been cleared.
Behind these cottages on the hill, there was a golf course that belonged to the Wawa Hotel.
So people could come up here and have a cottage lot and then also have their golf course literally right at their backyard.
And I can remember my parents playing golf there, but it was pretty rough. But it was 9 holes. I still could tell you exactly where those 9 holes are.
It was fantastic, the views that you got from up there, because you could see for miles and miles and miles down the lake. And now it's all trees.
And in front of the Silverthorne, the Forbes cottage over here, there's a little flat area, and that was the 9th green. It was during the war that wasn't kept up at all, and the Robertsons used to let their cows come along, walk along here, up the hill, and graze on the golf course.
My dad, you know, adored this lake. You know, he knew it because of fishing, and, you know, he didn't get many holidays in those days, and so the 2 weeks he had up here were just so precious, and he'd head off for the morning rise in his little putt-putt, which we essentially still have, and then evening fishing and bring in fresh bass and lake trout and clean them again off the back stoop. And
Then he'd have too many, so he'd knock on our door and say, I have extra fish. We'd say, we'll take it.
It becomes very special, and I think more so to my 2 brothers because they're in British Columbia. And so their connection back to their childhood, our childhood, to my parents is the cottage. That's what it represents to them.
And we're neighbors.
And
We live next door to Innisfree, where the old Smiley sisters lived. These funny women who wore bathing shoes and gave us treats when we were children.
And we used to go and buy the paper for them at Glenmount.
I remember often going and getting milk and bread and butter and sundry things for them at the store. We would always go by their cottage and just ask them if they needed anything because of their age.
It's a giant rock that's shaped like a strawberry. So when our youngest son was born, I don't know how we thought of it. My father and I decided one night that the next morning we'll get up at 6 a.m. and we're going to paint that because it looks like a strawberry. Let's paint it a strawberry. And he said, well, I have some red paint. So Dad and I painted the strawberry, and my father was very artistic, so then he started putting all the seeds on with the black. We had to wait for the red to dry, and we had to do it at 6 before people came along the road. And then there was, of course, the baby strawberry beside it. So now, I mean, my son is now 28. So people say, well, where do you live? Oh, I live 3 cottages past the strawberry. There was a teenager in every cottage. And so that we all got together. We were maybe 15 years old. So at night, we all wanted to have parties.
But people would get together at the Whittingham Loft, and we would have great parties there when we were teenagers. And not that we were that innocent, but I do remember having an Electro-Home tape recorder that reel-to-reel, that's where the music came from, that got destroyed because somebody spilled Freshie on it. So how innocent were we in those days that we're drinking Freshie and the sugar just ruined that old tape recorder?
We had to be home by 11. So then all the kids, we'd start at the end, and the kids would run up Glenmount Road, and they'd say, good night, good night.
It took years to confess to our parents that literally there were times I would take the screen off the bedroom and we would sneak out and we would paddle the boat out a couple hundred yards so that our parents would not hear that the engine had started in the boat, and then off to Big One and then back again. And as far as we knew, and I think that was fairly common around we would all get together at Big One when it was flourishing and sneak into various events and so on. And it was a wonderful, wonderful time, and that's how we got to know and still have friendships with so many people along the shoreline.
And we would climb out the window, which you can't do now, but you could then, and sunbathe on the roof, etc. So there are lots of things I could tell your kids what they could do.
There was a man, his name was Dan Watson, who was the sheriff, the postmaster. He delivered the garbage, he picked up the garbage, and he delivered milk. And he had a big truck, and it would go in the back road, and it was really, really bumpy. So you'd hear all the milk bottles banging together, and my brothers and I would get out, run outside, get in his truck, and if we delivered the milk, he would give us chocolate milk. So we would do all the cottages on the road, and he would think this is nirvana because kids are running and doing it for free, stuff he had to do.
And there used to be only one tennis court. It belonged to it was part of the hotel. And we used to play on it. And
But it was terrible, in terrible shape.
Oh yeah, it was rocky. And then we had to pull up the milkweeds because
the pavement had
the
cracked.
pavement had cracked. So every time there was cracked pavement, then the milkweeds. So we'd pull the milkweeds, and then we bought a net, and we just the cottagers here used it.
And for many, many years, my dad pretty well ran the tennis court, in a sense, in that he was involved with the YMCA. He would supply the tennis nets because they would get ripped and so on. And back in those days, they would have these huge milkweed things, weeds would grow up through the tennis courts, and we'd get out there and we'd hack them off.
My brother and I would hit the tennis ball until we couldn't see it anymore, you know. So, and prior to all of us owning our own spots up here, there was a time where we all had little ones, and we were all still staying at my mom and dad's place. So Saturday night, I mean, the barbecue was huge, and it was just steak, chicken, you know, whatever, big smorgasbord. We were feeding, you know, over probably 20 people with our spouses, but a lot of fun.
I would go in there and spend hours straightening the products in the store, and he would give me a chocolate bar. And now that I think of it, that was a heck of a deal.
And then the following year, I worked at Lake of Bays Lodge, which all that remains of Lake of Bays Lodge is shuffleboard, but it's down that way. And I was the chambermaid, and I slept upstairs here in the heat, and then I'd get up nice and early and take the path that runs along the back of all of these cottages and go to work, and then come back and have all afternoon.
In the days when everything was, you know, 3 or 5 for a penny, you could, you know, a nickel bought a lot of loot.
I came up with my brand new baby that was born 27th of June, and we were up here about two weeks later with my parents. So there's always a time, I think, with cottages when the children are teenagers and they do other things. I can remember Mother saying, don't ever sell the cottage because there's going to be a lull. And I guess there was for a little while when we had teenage jobs. My kids both were counselors at camp and all that kind of stuff. But they all come back. So Mom and Dad were the first generation, and my sister and I were the second. And my children were the third, and their children were the fourth. And now, I'm not here very often, but my grandchildren are bringing their children. So that's the 5th generation.
So now we have children, so our children, their paths cross, and so all these teenagers have children, so the children are up here, and now those children are having babies. So now we have another generation.
It's nice to see the tradition carrying on, and of my siblings, 4 of us have places on Lake of Bays. My parents still own on Glenmount Road, and 17 grandchildren that my mom and dad have, and it's great to see all the cousins taking advantage of the sailing club and the tennis club, and it's great that my siblings are all sort of scattered along Glenmount and Old 117, so really keeping the spirit alive.
One of the things that amazes me in a way is both for my brothers and their children who live in beautiful cities, Vancouver and Victoria. They love this place and they love the beauty of Muskoka, and they make a point of coming back every year and appreciating what we have here. It really is a very special place.
city houses seem to come and go when they're brought up there, but the cottages are different. There's a different feeling. And if I describe this place, you know, to somebody, well, it was built in 1904. It's really a terrible old place. It needs to be torn down, but nobody can afford to tear it down and start again. So we just glue it together. And then you describe that there's a road between the lake and the cottage, and everybody sort of frowns and says that you know, you can see them thinking, well, that's pretty terrible. But somehow or other, we're so used to that road, it ties us all together. And the kids have bicycles, and they can bike around. And somehow or other, it has become important. There are people who go too quickly on it. And it's busy at about 4 o'clock when the parents come to get the children at the sailing club. But other than that, I don't think it bothers us. I'd quite like to have it there. I'm used to it. It's part of the picture.
It's so interesting though, you know, just how nature goes. It's as if it's a totem pole. It just all goes back. It's made of wood. I mean, it was this thriving center with 2 hotels, tea house, gas station, store, post office, church, everything. And then all of it's gone. You look around and there's none of it left except the church repurposed into a sailing club.
As Glenmount, you look on maps and you still see Glenmount. And if you were driving here for the first time, you'd say, well, what's Glenmount? Where'd it go? Well, where it's gone is into our memories. And yet there's still things like the tennis club and the sailing club that keep it alive for us. And that beautiful dock down there, which is still used all the time for various events and so on, is the one structure, along with the Catholic Church, which is now the sailing club, which have remained. But it's like Bigwin, with Bigwin having been flourishing and then run down, and now with the golf course being there, it's a very nice experience to have something that was special to you before come back in a way, and that's what the sailing club has done.
This was the center of my existence.
It's a nice place for us to come, and it's really our second home.
I thought, this is where I'm moving to, and I haven't regretted it.
Almost to me, it's like history. Like you come back in history, and really when you see this cottage and the view here, it's exactly like it was when I was a kid. So it's like turning back the clock. You come down the hill, and as soon as you make the corner, it just reminds me of when I was a kid, and really not a lot has changed. And it's lovely that so many of the families are still here, and I think it's very special to be able to share the history. And I feel very honored and very proud that we've been here so long, and it just makes you feel really good. It really makes you feel like home.
It's now the only home that has always existed. So it's very familiar, and it's always the same, and it just, you know, it always has the same squeaks and noises. And
all the children love it. My eldest grandson said to me once, you know, Grammy, this is my favorite place. Well, I just loved to hear that because it was my favorite place too.
What was the one word that reminds you of here? And for me, it would have to be family.
it would be a different word in different seasons.
Memory, you know, it's family. It's my whole life. It's all the connections and all the people I love.
In the spring and the fall, it would be peaceful.
Wonderful. I mean, it's in my blood.
In the summertime, I would say it's friendly.
But I would say, I would just put a bubble around Glenmount, and in the bubble, I would put all my memories. And as soon as you come up this road, all these things just come out of your head. It's just very peaceful.
I think just simply spectacular. It's just, yeah, you almost can't put it into words, I would say.
I honestly can't come up with a single word to describe it, because you can't. I can't simplify it into just one word, because it represents so many memories and so many wonderful things that both in the past and knowing it when we were teenagers, and now knowing it as an adult is very, very different.
I think there's a community life that is important here. The fact that we all get along, and the next generation, it looks as though it's all going to be the same again, and to me, that means a great deal. So, love of nature. It's a beautiful place, and it's peaceful. There's your one word.
Yeah.